Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the long-awaited final edition of myself and Dominus, trawling through Andrew Roberts' biography, Churchill, Walking with Destiny. If you were with us until now, we started looking back at Churchill's formative years, his years in the wilderness after his Gallipoli campaigns, which was dealt with mainly in part 2. We've done this 3 parts before. This is going to be part 4 and the final part. We will wrap it up today. And then we had a third part, which was the 30s and the lead up to war, up to and including his attainment to the premiership and the fall of France. So we're about at the Battle of Britain, turning into the Blitz, and we're just going to kick it off from there to see this final phase of Churchill's life and see if there's any insight we can glean between. I mean, this will encapsulate the proper collapse of empire, which of course he set out to save. So that this sort of whole bittersweet feeling to this part. How are you, Dominus, and how are you feeling about tonight's attempt?
Yes, I'm doing very well, and I'm feeling rather optimistic that we can finish this off tonight.
Yes, so Dominus has been messaging me, and we've been putting it off and back and forth, so it's finally occurring. We're going to get it. And I'd like to say just more broadly as well, I'm going to put an effort to wrap up some other series which have been hanging close to completion on the channel over the forthcoming weeks. So yeah, let's pick up on the Battle of Britain. Now that's just to get a sense of the scale of Roberts' book. Of course, we alluded to this before, that he splits the whole thing into 2 parts, one preparation, one trial. And the trial really begins in 1940. So we've already gotten the beginning of that trial. War is declared, but then the proper war happens after the sort of phony war. And without Chamberlain gone, now Churchill's in the hot seat. And we're really at a point where Britain is alone, and Churchill's falling back on kind of his oratory skills. We had the speech after Dunkirk that they would never surrender, and then this is really much Britain alone in the Battle of Britain from June to September 1940. And Roberts opens up with, quote, at the beginning of that chapter 22 in his book, we're on page 562, Hitler could do anything he liked where there was no salt water to cross, but it would avail him nothing if he reached the Great Wall of China, and this island remained undefeated. Churchill, July 1940. That's pretty much the spirit where we pick off. What are your thoughts, Dominus, on, I suppose, this idea that they would go on regardless? Was there ever any realistic chance of brokering a peace? It's often mooted, perhaps more slightly in 1941 than in 1940 right now, once Hitler properly fails to land any sort of credible invasion. Or do you think the spirit here is just classic resolve? Because for me, it doesn't get... Later you can see, and we can flesh this out, it gets very mingled. Of course, his mother being American, the progression of the war and his aims get very mingled with turning away from simply Britain to this wider concept of the English-speaking peoples, and that to be a victory for them. At least that's how I read it in Churchill's mind. But at this point, it's just Fortress Britain. So do you think there's any realistic chance that there could be a British peace here, or is it always going to end up with the larger American involvement? And is Churchill even eyeing that?
I think Roberts himself comments at one point that Churchill's notion that brokering a peace was absolutely and utterly impossible was sort of mistaken, and I think that's true. Like Churchill had certain, I suppose, in some respects, Churchill had blinkers on when it came to the prospect of a peace because of his ideological convictions. But as Roberts says, it was good that it was sort of good that he wasn't aware that there was a possibility to broker a peace, or he didn't consider it because because I suppose that would have it would have changed the shape of, I guess, the world order after the war. So I do think there was a possibility. Now, do you think there was a possibility as well? Do you agree with that?
I think there's definitely characters who could have accepted a peace, but it's difficult to know once you have Hitler at the wheel, it's difficult to know how
Oh yeah,
final
well
anything would have
he was a
been.
madman. So
Like for instance, you could have perhaps nailed one there, and then within 4 months, it's gone out the window. I mean, the rules and protocols of an enduring peace, I don't think they probably weren't there, because of course you have the Eastern Front, and it's such a movable feast. And if Hitler had been successful there, then he would have wanted to go back and undo any terms he had done on the Western Front, most likely. So it's difficult to find an everlasting one. And also, I think it ultimately does come back to characters, though. If there was a character there for it, yes, but Churchill was not the character for it. And I think
he was not the character.
Even gets there is the Hun hatred from the First World War is still there, I think, in his mind, and he has that ability to switch it on during wartime. And also, I'm just going to move forward to page 570. The Germans began daylight bombing in early July, initially targeting aircraft productions and munition factories and other facilities of the south coast, but also in places as far afield as Norwich, Newcastle, and Newport. And I think this sort of campaign would have, on a character like Churchill, which had the opposite effect of brokering anything like that. And we'll get to this later. I think even when he's walking into Tunis, Churchill, having reconquered North Africa, and his mind is on Carthage and empires and falls. He was willing to let this be like a bombing to obliteration or a victory. He always seemed to have that in mind.
As was, and then of course he responded with the bombing of Dresden and other places. So yeah.
Yeah, 1st of July, Churchill asked Ismay to investigate drenching the beaches with mustard gas in the event of an invasion. So there's not really going to be. Well, that gives two things, right? There was a credible thought of invasion, of like an amphibious attack, but yeah, no chance of peace. I mean, he was willing to go with the mustard gas. Go back to again. He's probably thinking of the previous war there, but he was willing to go to the horrors of that First World War again, which not many people were.
Yeah, no one was willing to return to that. Even, I mean, yeah, neither side in the Second World War. Despite, I mean, well, I suppose they weren't. At least the Germans weren't willing to use it in the actual fighting fields, although they were willing to use it in other cases. But anyway, so that's yeah.
Yeah, I actually have it here. For even if that man, as he always called Hitler, that man, were at the Caspian, and there was nothing to stop him going there, we should bring him back and find a fire in his own backyard. We'll make Germany a desert. Yes, a desert. Churchill assumed that Hitler would turn on the USSR long before ultra decrypts started to hint at that. That's what Roberts gives us there, page 570.
I'll say this: I think Churchill had a superior understanding, even if there had been a possibility of a peace with a different character other than Churchill in charge. I think Churchill, more than any character that would have potentially brokered a peace, had a better grasp of Hitler's fundamental character. Like he really, I think he understood him in sort of in this psychological way that no one else really had the ability to grasp. I think. Would you agree with that judgment?
Yeah, I think so. I think
like on the Allied side, I mean,
yeah, I think he's definitely I think the other thing we need to consider though at this point is that is when the Blitz gets drawn out, September 40 to January, so that he is eventually successful. I'm not a military story. I'm not going to go down into the failure of Hitler in the Battle of Britain, but you did have this idea that once that had failed by September 40, it's quite obvious that the Germans had lost that ability to either make Britain collapse or, to broker any sort of peace there. They would turn eastward, and then they play this long waiting game. I think Churchill was certainly that character of the coalition, but then you have to bear in mind the coalition more broadly. And I think in this Blitz period, there's this. There's also around this time Neville Chamberlain dies, and there's this period where the characters, I think, of the coalition does start to become a little more Labour dominant, and it'll hint towards what happens after the war. So he
Yes.
says to James Stewart, a Chamberlainite MP, Churchill said, "What shall I do without poor Neville? I was relying on him to look after the home front for me." And I think was a good point I picked up on about page 617 now, that he would eventually lose this home front to Attlee in a certain sense. But Chamberlain, even though you say he couldn't handle the war effort, was always very popular at home. I think we discussed some of this throughout the 30s.
Yeah, he was,
And
and
was he
in
Home
fact,
Secretary for a long time before he finally got the PM job, I believe.
I'm not
So
sure
Chamberlain
how
would have
long
been
he was
more
home
adept
secretary, but
to the home front
he was
situation, I think, as you came out of war. And his death is often not considered in that light, I think.
his funeral was actually, it was well, yeah, I mean, I think Churchill made a rousing speech at his funeral, and which I think attested to the degree to which Chamberlain was admired at home. You know, he may have been an unfortunate, and I'd still say he was a bad prime minister, but he was not a reviled prime minister in the way that you think of other bad prime ministers, like David Cameron, for example, who's positively reviled. But Chamberlain was never the butt of such obloquy from the populace, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just think that was an interesting sense that though, yes, he's going for the throat of Hitler, that the home front will start to seep in the long Blitz, the long era of the Blitz. You have other points where you can see Germany gets stretched while he plays the waiting game, really, to try and bring America in. I'm not sure exactly when the Lend-Lease came in, but once that was in, there was never any chance, really, I think, of Britain having a sort of starvation or collapse morally on the home front. So Lend-Lease comes in a little bit later in 41. But I think there was never any really chance of it collapsing. So we can move on then to, Germany starts to get more stretched while they play the waiting game. I think that's really what happens in these Blitz chapters. There's an invasion of Greece. And actually in Churchill's mind, that invasion of Greece, he plays an important role. At least that's how Roberts tries to portray it. Because
Wasn't it?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, sorry. Wasn't it that the invasion of didn't the invasion of Greece actually sort of weakened the Nazis' ability to conquer the USSR because they pulled tanks and soldiers from that were preparing for the Russian invasion down to.
I think the idea from the German perspective was to ensure they wouldn't be cut off from the south. But I mean, to go all the way to Greece and then eventually even into Crete was like you're securing your south to the detriment of your actual initial attack. Like it was complete overstretch.
And Churchill actually responded. Didn't British soldiers responded to they fought in Greece, right, against the German
invasion.
invasion.
It was quite important to Churchill, I think, and that's where it comes across where this was a man of the previous age, of like even the pre-First World War age, because he deals with Greece in terms of the
Byronic
civilizational
age. Yes,
he's always reading Byron, or I know Horace is a Roman, but he'd like to quote Horace a lot. Yeah, I think even later. It's possibly later around DDay, or I think it's around 1945, and he takes like an hour out to recite Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which is insane.
Well, I think his response in Greece was seen as a strategic error, is right at the time, and it still is. However, is that the case? I can't remember if it's. What impact did the British response have to the broader strategy?
I think, well, it probably didn't have a lot to the broader strategy, but Churchill took personal care in securing Greece. And I think even on the other side, when he didn't want it to go communist at the end, like the rest of Eastern Europe, he maintained that he saved Greece. He couldn't save Poland, which of course, if going back, that's the reason why they went into the war. He couldn't save Poland to be nominally independent, but Western democracy, but he could save Greece.
Yeah.
And that was his sort of saving grace, because he was caught up in all of the emotion that had to do with that landscape, which of course had also happened to him in the First World War. So it's like a reoccurring beat. I think also 1940.
I suppose though, if
carry on.
If the British had hadn't responded in Greece and the Germans had an easy time of it just taking it, it would have actually made it easier. Like it would have shortened the timeline for them to. It would have made it easier for them to sort of bring the men and the tanks, like back or right for the Russian invasion. I mean, wasn't it there was like a time constraint? If he hadn't responded in Greece, then the Russian invasion would have been easier to pull off, I think.
Yes, because they have to overcommit men to really
Yeah.
down into the Balkans. I think that's possibly an element. I'd have to go back and confirm that in terms of military strategy. I'm not an expert on the movements of the units in World War II, which is there's a lot of material on it, so I don't want to pretend to be an expert on it. The only other caveat, I mean, as well at this point, right, 40-41, this transition. Lloyd George dies in 1940. So I think there is this real passing of the guard with Chamberlain and
Lloyd George, yeah.
Like these big characters are dropping away. He sends Halifax off to the US, actually, I think, as well in 1940. So by this time, you're beginning to see the fulcrum of, yes, Churchill going for the throat of Germany at all costs, but also the Labour coalition movement coming up, and that new dynamic is being established. And that, like, this is the only other thing of saying peace or not, just wrap that bit up, is on 642. I just noticed this bit of like the cost of the early entry in general. That could they not have, yes, joined against Germany, but at a later stage, so as not to exhaust their supplies and be so reliant on the United States. And Britain was hanging on in the war for as long as possible until something showed up to turn the tide against Germany. Although at this stage, 40-41, there was little to suggest what that might be. Churchill's own hopes for the United States to declare war, or for Hitler to overreach himself by attacking Russia for a decisive British victory in North Africa, or for an uprising across occupied Europe, all seemed far-fetched to varying degrees at the time, and British strategic policy at the time might best be described on his own maxim, keep buggering on. So there's an extent to which it's not great to be seen in that situation. I mean, yes, he ultimately clung to the US when they came in, but perhaps if you hadn't entered that early, you wouldn't have found yourself in that situation. So you could admire the spirit, but there is a bit there with the strategy of the early entry, and being so exposed in these years really did cost them later on when it was more obvious that the Allied side was going to win and there was going to be a coalition and the new world order had to be set.
Yes.
Britain didn't find itself in that strong position. Now, we'll move on then, and we'll start to shift towards 41 into 42. I'm still in keep buggering on, but on page 650, you have to start thinking about Japan. And there's this whole other concept to Britain and the empire. And of course, Churchill always spoke in those terms, was Britain as the Oriental power. That any attack by Japan in the Far East would provoke an American intervention. Yes, that's one thing. But there was, to his mind, no need, this top of page 650, to make a priority of fortifying either Singapore or Hong Kong.
Yes.
And this is probably a grave mistake.
There's a vast strategic error.
Yeah. Do you think there was anything, I mean, for myself, it probably makes sense. Like the Americans, yes, they could be your allies, but they're not Britain. They are not you. And I think sometimes Churchill is liable to get caught up in that fact, particularly because he's half American. And I think we discussed earlier, he's over in New York in previous parts of his life quite often. If you treat the US as a different sort of ally, does not make sense to secure your, I don't know, there seemed to be no strategy of pitching Japan against the US. And if Japan were expanding across Asia, you did seem to make yourself more vulnerable. These spots, Singapore, Hong Kong, which of course is the prestige and the Asiatic imperial mindset that kind of faded away from Britain, but was there at the start of the 20th century. I mean, you're a fan of Forster and that whole idea of the passage to India. Like there is that part of the Britain, which by the time we finish this stream and we're into the 50s and 60s is just gone. And you could say ironic considering, they then start getting immigration from India and so on, but there's actually less of a prestige of viewing themselves as an Asiatic power. or in those Asiatic imperial terms.
Yeah, I thought the whole way in which Britain sort of, and maybe you can date the spiritual decline of that spirit, of that posture or idea to, I think, like, to the Second World War. I guess you can say, like, yeah, this was the time when Britain sort of they looked east and they looked west, and they're like, well, we can sort of allow the eastern part of our great empire to sort of just fall off, and now we're just going to focus on Europe and the Americas. And there's something that is indescribably noble, in my opinion, about the old British imperial mindset, which did look very much to the east. When Calcutta was the second city of the British Empire, that they sort of just seem to, I don't know, slough off and just forget, which maybe it attests to the fact that ultimately it didn't make much of a mark. The East didn't make much of a mark on the British spirit.
It didn't have that sort of, Alexander into Persia full-on effect of both get so tangled up and become this sort of neo-Hellenic thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to happen to the same degree.
It doesn't. And I think the fall of Singapore was like, I remember, I will say they didn't arm Singapore well enough, but Singapore was still armed. And in fact, I think the man who surrendered at Singapore, the general, did not realize that he in fact still had the manpower to defeat the Japanese at Singapore. It was not really a
I've actually just got it up here quickly. Strength 85,000 on the British side and only 36,000 on the Japanese side. I mean, that is damning.
It was more of a, I mean, they were just terrified. They were terrified because they had heard the legends of or not the legend, the real, the whispers and the rumors of what the Japanese army was capable of. But how they just totally gave up the city was, I think, you can't really use the excuse of not better armed for the actual fall of Singapore. Like, okay, I don't know, because maybe if they had armed it better, then they would have had more confidence. But they already had enough manpower as it was, and arms, to see off the Japanese. So I'm not sure what that was, but it was both a blunder from the government in Britain and a blunder from the administration in Singapore. And that sort of, that's like I guess that's the spiritual bookend of the British.
Many people mark it right there and then, February 1942. I just got some passages leading up to this. I'll see if I have anything highlighted around the events itself, but just leading up to this event. I'm on page 651. Keep buggering on is the chapter, but just on May 3rd. So this would have been 41. So still some months before the fall. But just an introduction to his mindset. Churchill gets, you could say, blinded by the Germany question, and perhaps it was a world war by 41 to 42. Yes, he was right to it was called raising the alarm in the late 30s. And he was right to see that to a certain extent. And Roberts brings it back to his experience with the Mahdi and the Sudan, which I think I recommend everyone to go back and check our stream on that, because I think we did some good content on that.
Yeah, that was a nice discussion.
So, but by 42, he's still operating in a 1937, 1938 mindset. Could be, that's an accusation you hear thrown around. I'm just trying to throw sort of new insights in myself that I don't hear people say all the time. That now this is a world war, strategy should take over more than just raising the alarm and bringing down, quote, that man. But anyway, May 3rd, 41. Here's his speech, and you can see this is all European civilizational terms. On May 3rd, he broadcast this speech. All over Europe, races and states whose culture and history made them a part of the general life of Christendom in centuries when the Prussians were no better than a barbarous tribe and the German Empire no more than an agglomeration of pumpernickel principalities, are now prostrate under the dark, cruel yoke of Hitler and the Nazi regime. And then going into the next chapter, 25, being met together June 41 to January 42. This is the king's. We should mention this actually. One of the big things of the Roberts' book is that he got access to the king's George VI diary, and so he gives us little insights into that throughout, which it wasn't in previous biographies. And we see one of them here where the king wrote down, he looks to one goal and one goal only, winning the war, no half measures. And I think that tied with the earlier speeches, like that meant heading to Berlin. And I'm titling this part of the stream as Fall of Berlin and Beyond. And perhaps the eye in this time should have been more global.
Well, yeah, I mean, and it's the way that also like VE Day in culture, in sort of, I mean, look, the fact is that I think the war was fundamentally, despite it being a world war, it was fundamentally a war of European civilization. Nonetheless, the manner in which they just seemed, it's like it's like Britain, or maybe even the entire West, developed like a lazy eye almost. Maybe not the Americans, but Britain certainly. One eye was focused and one was just sort of, I don't know, rolling out of control. And I'll say one thing though in favor of the British position in the East. The Japanese armies, I think their greatest defeat was at the hands of the British Indian Army when they tried to enter India through Burma. The battles of I forget the name, but there are these two major battles that happened, and they were in which an enormous number of men were lost, but which basically cut off the Japanese from India. It prevented them from entering India and taking it. And I think it was called the Stalingrad of the East. And that was a great moment for Britain and for India, I'll say that as well. But overall, I still believe that the failure to sort of, get things in hand strategically in the East was an unfortunate blunder that stained the prosecution of the war from the start.
Yeah, and of course I do have to caveat some of this by the fact he seemed somewhat justified, because by the time that it happened, you had Barbarossa, which was stalling, because it had begun in the summer of 41, and then there was the chapters leading up to this being met together shows that there was panic in Moscow, and they begin to establish the Soviets on their side, and then by the time of February 42, this is they get preoccupied with that European theater, and you also have the Americans entering the war with Pearl Harbor as well by that point. So you could even say it's well, the Pearl Harbor one probably should have made them think more about the Pacific as a theater. But from the Soviet perspective, I think they perhaps a little bit of complacency with regards to the Pacific theater, because they felt the buggering on and the Britain alone piece was over now, and they felt a little bit uplifted by the other events, that they actually took their eye off the prize, or let their guard down, I suppose, more than that.
Oh, here I have the names of the battles I was talking about. The Battle of Impal and Kohima. Those are the names of the two battles in British India, when Japanese armies attempted to invade India, but were driven back into Burma with heavy losses. So there were these roads that they tried to that they were ambushed on and destroyed, and I think. Yeah, it was a major turning point in the theater of the war at that time. It was the largest Japanese military defeat, and many Japanese deaths also were from starvation and exhaustion during the retreat. So anyway, that's it. I just wanted to note that for anyone who doesn't want to, find out more about it, the battles of Impal and Kohima.
Yeah, no, I think I might read up more on them myself. I mean, it's interesting. We'll get into the Indian National Congress a bit later. But I have some bits here as well. It should be noted, Churchill's strategy of being half American and wanting the Americans back in so much, that 692, you get an insight into his euphoria at hearing about Pearl Harbor, of course, from his thinking of the war, that's perspective. Although Germany and the United States were not yet at war, Churchill wrote in his war memoirs of his euphoria that evening. No American will think it wrong of me if I proclaim that to have the United States at our side was to me the greatest joy. So we had won after all. Yes, after Dunkirk, after the fall of France, after the horrible episode of Iran, and the threat of invasion, we had won the war. England would live, Britain would live, the Commonwealth of Nations and the Empire would live. Once this is what he thought of with the States coming in. Once again, in our Long Island history, we should emerge, however, mauled or mutilated, safe and victorious. We should not be wiped out. History would not come to an end. I thought of a remark in which Edward Grey had made to me more than 30 years before, that the United States is like, quote, a gigantic boiler. Once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. I mean, he's in his own words there. He's got the ominous. I mean, there's a lot in that. Yeah, being saturated and satiated with emotion and sensation, I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. And Roberts gives us that entire passage unbroken, which I thought was quite powerful, especially in the context of what you know, how the 20th century develops.
Well, it's a powerful, but okay. I mean, did Churchill, because I've read elsewhere, and maybe even in Robert's book, that Churchill had a sense, even though he proclaimed that this was all, this was to save the empire. He had a sense that in fact this was the empire's final chapter. I mean, or was that only something develops, that began to emerge towards the end of the war?
Yeah, having read this piece, it does emerge, and it's hard to say exactly when. I mean, there is obvious end of empire days going back to the India Bill, which he objects to. So I think at that point he still has fight in him. And we talked about that in the previous part in the 30s. So there's still some fight in him. And then I think perhaps it just gets drawn out in these years, 40 to 45, slowly but surely. I think by the time of 45, certainly when he gets put into opposition and his ability to manipulate the peace is removed from him quite considerably. I think that's when we see him more than not have the opinion that the whole period 40 to 45 was the empire's last showing to the world in terms of its grand civilizational effort. Up until that point, I actually think it grows throughout the 5 years, but I don't think it becomes subsuming until then. In 45, I actually think it goes all the way to the end. So yeah, I think we dealt with a little bit there on Singapore, and everyone can look up those periods. These are the chapters: being met together, disaster, which runs January to June 1942. I want to get through to. We start to see some stuff in Desert Victory. And his dealings with Stalin start to come more into the fray. I'm just going to see if I don't have any notes. I don't know if you had. Well, I'll just check if I have anything, not missing out on anything that you can give any insight you have on how his relationship with Stalin developed over these years.
42,
so 43.
It was a fascinating relationship. I think whenever I think of his relationship with Stalin, I think of that moment when maybe it was at one of the later conferences, Yalta or wait, I can't. No. It was one of the. What was the conference that was held on Churchill's birthday? Maybe that was the Tehran conference. I think, where he is sitting with Stalin, and he's like, and there are interpreters as well who are there, but basically Churchill and Stalin just get absolutely hammered. Like they keep drinking and drinking and drinking into the night.
Both famous long drinkers independently, so I can only imagine.
Yeah. Oh, it must have been extraordinary. And then with Churchill toasting the proletarian masses and Stalin toasting the Tory party. It's a pretty hilarious. That's the I think the ultimate image of the Churchill-Stalin relationship, which of course was ended by the Iron Curtain speech in Missouri. I think it was Missouri. But I think strategically speaking, I think Churchill was sort of I think Stalin basically outmaneuvered both Churchill and Roosevelt. Although some say Roosevelt was sort of, he wanted this to happen. He was in cooperation with all of Stalin's endeavors. I think that's going a little far, but he was certainly, yeah. I don't think that they really understood Stalin's character to its fullest extent, and I don't think, I read that book Diplomacy by Kissinger, and he talks about how the diplomatic manipulation of of um, of Stalin's diplomatic machinations at the beginning of the war, and how he calls it Stalin's bazaar, how he set up like a bazaar, oh, I'll be your ally, like ally to the highest bidder, right? And that type of thing. And how he just sort of played with the Nazis and the Allies, and then once on the Allied side, the way he just sort of, I think he continued to outplay them, to outplay Churchill and Roosevelt, and that's why you have at the beginning of the war, you have the Soviet Union as this sort of industrializing, but really internally focused power that doesn't really have much heft or weight in the actual diplomatic world, to the end of the war, where it's just this massive empire armed to the teeth, and humming with the industry and everything. It was and that was Stalin. So yes, I believe the personal relationship was friendly, quite friendly, more friendly in fact than Roosevelt and Stalin's relationship, even if you would like to claim that Roosevelt cooperated with Stalin, and then which he did to an extent, but it was also very. I think Stalin got more out of that than Churchill ever did, considering the results. And actually, I think the growth of the Soviet Union under Stalin is sort of reminiscent of the way that, China sort of became really, China from the Cultural Revolution. I sort of compare the state of China to the state of the Soviet Union before the war, and then into their growth into this massive imperial, behemoth after the reforms of Deng Xiaoping and that kind of thing. The growth of these powers is sort of similar in extent, and I think the historical comparison doesn't quite work because there's a war in one case and there isn't in another, but it's paralleled, and the way that the West keeps getting outplayed by these figures. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it's definitely an interest. I can't really it's one that escapes me a little bit, how he could be so hawkish on Hitler yet dovish to Stalin. I mean, that flips, but so late in the day, as you say, that St. Louis speech, by which point he's in opposition. I'm not sure exactly, because there's no, we talked, this is where I'm moving on to the chapter Desert Victory, June to November 42. And it's about the North African theater. Montgomery makes his name there. You begin to see, I alluded to this earlier, it ends with his fall of Tunis, and Churchill is alluding it to Carthage, and he gets sucked into grand, like I could see if somehow there was a Roman, I could almost see like Mussolini wooing him somehow with some ancient Roman thing and Horace, and appealing to that cultural side of him, because when he's in the North African theater, he's still thinking of Egypt, and he's thinking of all these grand, that's not there really with Russia, that to sort of woo the Harrow schoolboy, so to speak. So it does kind of, I do find it strange. Perhaps it's just the feeling of there's elements of him which was comfortable rerunning great war fronts, right, and just flank out Germany, just fall back on that sort of experience that had been formidable to a lot of men who'd lived through the 1914 to 18. I think that's possibly an overriding factor.
Yeah, I think so. That's actually a decent insight. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm on page like 747 now. Stalin wanted to meet Churchill in Moscow. Again, that's a sign of power, right? Stalin Stalin was very. I think he ends up going to Tehran, but a lot of the other ones, you have one in Crimea. He has Churchill, and you notice this. Churchill in these chapters is flying all around. I don't know how
Stalin hated
shot down
flying,
over
right?
Cairo
Yeah.
or anything like this. He's always in the air, flying around North Africa in these months. Partly because he loves it. I mean, we'd established that in his character.
He adores flying, yes.
Yeah, or just being in the thick of the action, more generally. In life.
But both of it. Yeah, it was.
That even in his older years, he didn't leave him. So let's see what have I got here.
I mean, he was kind of like almost. I guess he was sort of like, he has a thrill-seeking character almost, which, you know, permeates his actions even as his physical body declines and
Yeah, so I have it here, 757. Churchill would not discover Stalin's true views about him because after June 41, Britain's intelligence services were ordered not to spy on Britain's new Soviet ally. A mistaken policy, I think Roberts correctly calls that was certainly not reciprocated. One thing we failed to mention by 40 was that they'd cracked the Enigma Code. Which helped Alan Turing, so much in that whole Battle Blitz era. And then, considering that was
Churchill
success,
responsible for that operation?
I'm not sure how much he had to do with it. Considering Roberts glossed over it fairly quickly, I can't really say he was too much involved. Unless you know otherwise.
No, I don't. I'm not sure the extent to which he was. He did have a good relationship with many mathematicians and physics professors, even though he himself was famously poor at mathematics. But I'm not sure if he ever. I guess.
But not. But that doesn't sound like, you've talked against civilization. That doesn't sound like an exhausted civilization that cracks the Enigma Code.
No, it does not at all.
So why then this turn then to not spy on Moscow or to get decrypt anything that's coming out of the Soviet Union? It seems very strange.
Well, I think like the final bits of vitality of the British Empire, you can spot them in the brilliance and the almost the magic that had been built up over the course of 200 years. These were like it basically spent itself. You could view it to such an extent in some parts in the Second World War because it was all vomited out, and they unevenly as well, and they didn't have the capacity for more.
So again, I'm using what Roberts brings out, the King's Diaries here, 757. Sorry. To the King, Churchill described Stalin as a, quote, a cold, uncouth man, but with an understanding mind. In private, both he and Molotov smiled and even laughed at Winston's answers to their somewhat pertinent questions to the past. There's a thing here that is very different to Churchill. Stalin knows nothing of the rest of the world. Despite, he was the one who went for socialism in one country. It suits the character. A much more insular man. I think as well, I read Stephen Cochrana's 2 volumes. There's a third coming out eventually, I don't know when, on Stalin. And the second volume of that, there's so much happening, and Stalin himself is basically in this tiny office for the whole thing, just pacing around his office.
He was always this sort of this small, insular-minded bureaucratic operator that sort of. Stalin had a decent grasp of personal dynamics and of diplomacy, theoretically, but he was not a man of history.
It's quite ironic considering the communist doctrine of scientific history and solving revolution, that Stalin's powers are all in character dynamics and in personalities and these non-scientific terms, quite like non-Marxist appreciation.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that sense of that Marxist dogma of scientific history was actually something to which he was deeply committed. It helped to guide his actions in it, arguably the reason why he was so good at these personal dynamics but he didn't actually know anything about but history itself. Like he just thought, yes, history is this great process that in which, you know, societies rise and fall, develop in certain ways, and you know, at the end of it all, there'll be this communist utopia. But when it comes to the actual events of the rise and fall, all of those empires, and the development of these specific societies, he was totally uninterested. And maybe that actually fits the Marxist mindset, because they see the specifics as entirely irrelevant, and only the theory, because it'll all have the same result. So the specifics are irrelevant. I guess that's what it is, right?
Kind of. It still strikes me as oxymoronic.
It is.
But we'll pivot, because on the same page 757, there's a pivot to 9th of September now 42. Churchill informed that the Indian Congress Party would offer only passive resistance should the Japanese invade the subcontinent, and would not help the British defend it. Quote, I hate Indians, Churchill apparently told Amory. They are beastly people with a beastly religion. This is an instance, I think, of a classic quote, and when you put it in the
blown out of context,
like completely. There's nothing wrong with that like the stakes being so high, and then to hear that from the Indian National Congress, something which he never really wanted to be a power in India in the first place. Like he would be felt vindicated again by what he was saying back in the 30s here. So, but that's the exact sort of quotes you would see taken out of context.
Exactly. I mean, and the fact is, the reason that the Indian National Congress would offer only passive resistance was okay. Well, it was related somewhat to their personal antipathy to the British, but it was also very directly linked to their religion, their idea. The Hindu ideas of, you know, well, actually, I'm not sure if these are Hindu ideas or if it's just Gandhi's twisting of Hinduism into his own weird personal cult. But
well, that's its own great biographies discussion, I think. Gandhi. I actually don't know what the best one is on that, to be honest.
He was a ghastly man, I have to say. But anyway, yeah, sorry. Moving on.
I think we dealt with that actually a little bit, didn't we, in the previous one, Churchill and Gandhi. So, yeah. So Friday, 23rd October 42. That is Montgomery's offensive on El Alamein. That is the decisive desert victory. Again, the terms by which Churchill takes this. By 4th of November, Rommel was in full retreat. Montgomery's army had captured 30,000 Axis troops, and that evening, Montgomery dined with German General Ritter von Thoma. And this is the strange bit, isn't it? That North African campaign is the closest to the kind of chivalric thing in such a barbaric war. You had it in the First World War. It was in the flying, right? The Knights of the Sky. And here it seemed to be that desert campaign. I'm not sure if it was just the grandiose of the setting and the fact some of these German generals could...
and the Christmas truce as well, remember?
Yes. Well, that's 14, before people knew how... Anyway. But I think there's something perhaps to the German generals here as well, who could get out of Hitler's sort of ideological grasp. I mean, wasn't that one of the... Again, I'm not an expert on this, but wasn't that one of the reasons people... I mean, why was Rommel down there in such a peripheral theater when Barbarossa was going on? Was because perhaps he wasn't as ideologically aligned with Hitler as he should have been, or he rumbled him up the wrong way. So there was these generals who actually should have been somewhere else. They had this great old German, old Prussian sense of chivalry. And but of course, Churchill, when he hears that Montgomery's dining with Richard von Thoma. Napoleon and Marlborough used to dine with defeated generals in their tents after battles. So when an MP complained privately about Montgomery's actions, Churchill replied gravely, "Poor von Thoma, I too have dined with Montgomery." And again, yeah, you can definitely see, I think Churchill would have been thinking about Marlborough and his ancestors.
Oh, yes, most certainly.
So we move on. I think after that, it's all kind of it gears towards D-Day, and it gears towards the strategy of how do you get back onto the continent.
Did we discuss his? Okay, so now we can discuss this this strategy, right? The pincer or whatever type of strategy he thought.
It comes up quite often, I think, when Roberts gives interviews about his book. This because Churchill led this, didn't he?
He did, yeah. Churchill had this idea, but they didn't fully follow everything that he. Okay, one mistake that Churchill made was calling Italy the soft underbelly, right?
Yeah, that's the famous. That's like what you consider the tactic you get in through the peninsula, because once you have Tunis, you're hanging close to Italy, and you'll be up into the Alps before you know it, sort of thing.
Yeah, and the overall thrust of this idea that they needed to allow the dominoes to fall in southern Europe, in Italy, and on that front, before actually assaulting the German front. So basically, just cut off the German Empire, isolate it, and then attack it head on. Was I think, did Churchill invent the strategy, or was it a strategy that he sort of came up with in discussions with generals, or what was it? Again, I don't remember exactly how he conceived it, but he did play a large part in putting it into action.
I think the concept of it was his. I mean, the quote at the start of chapter 28, "One continent redeemed." Again, this is the other access Robert has in his book, is the notes to Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador to Britain at the time. They're the two kind of big notes, the King's Diaries and the Maisky ones, which are new to this book. Basically, I'm commander-in-chief here. This is Churchill quote to Maisky. "Naturally enough, I can't always carry out what I want, but I can always prevent that which I don't." So I think the grand strategy was his, and Americans didn't like it, right? Wasn't it Eisenhower? They wanted the sledgehammer.
They did, and I think D-Day happened a little bit earlier than Churchill would have liked, right?
Yeah. Like some sort of compromise eventually happened, but Churchill held a lot of sway in holding it out and going for Italy first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I read an analysis somewhere that if Churchill's plan in Europe had been followed to a T, without the interventions of the Americans, that is not the American troops, but without the strategic intervention of American generals, then the war could have been shortened by like some 8 months to a year or something like that.
You do also have to, not just to like American bash. He's had de Gaulle in his ear, right, since 40 as well, on getting Paris back. So it's not just the Americans who I think would have been annoyed by this strategy. And actually, there's points at which de Gaulle annoys everybody, right? Something in his character on that.
Yes.
But as Roberts points out, Churchill always stood by him, as in there was a lot of internal French maneuvering going on as to be who would be the prop to be placed in Paris once it was taken again. And a lot of people didn't like de Gaulle, but Churchill always stood by him, even though he
indeed because Churchill saw de Gaulle in a historical sense. He saw him as one of the great men of history that would lead France out of the darkness. So even if he didn't like him personally, he viewed him in a way that he might have almost viewed the previous, the Pompidou. Was it Pompidou? No. Who sorry, it was
Pétain, who had
no, not Pétain.
Churchill's obsession with Clemenceau, was it?
Clemenceau, sorry, yes, a terrible mistake. Anyway, yes, Clemenceau. The way that he viewed Clemenceau as this, this grand, this great man of French history. I think he viewed de Gaulle in a similar way.
Did he add Clemenceau in one of his books? Great contemporaries, or one of that.
Great contemporaries, I think de Gaulle, before it was evident that de Gaulle was in fact a great man of French history, Churchill saw in him the fundamentals that form such people, and that is why I think he stuck with him.
Yeah, I mean, just to go more broadly on the underbelly point, I don't really have a position. I don't think I've looked at poured into the strategic ideas of it too much.
Neither have I.
But I know when Roberts goes on these tours, he always stands up for Churchill. I mean, of course he would, because the Americans sometimes think the Americans were right, and he's always touring these East Coast. I think actually sometimes the West. He tours the American coasts quite often. Roberts, and he always has to try and stand up for Churchill.
I think it's mostly the East Coast. You're right, like New York, and
I just know he's also part of the Hoover Institute, though, who are out there on.
Yeah, that's true.
So page 764 again, while all this is happening, I think, and there's probably a good book to be done this of itself, like what exactly Labour policy was in the coalition and how much were they crafting towards that election victory in 45. But Cripps, right? This is Stafford Cripps, who would go on to be Attlee's Chancellor of the Exchequer 47 to 50, I think, a little bit later after the election, but he was in that Labour government. Cripps was made Minister for Aircraft Production, a position no longer in the War Cabinet, where he stayed for the rest of the war.
Beaverbrook's position? Or maybe did they change it? I don't know.
Yeah, but I'm not sure. Beaverbrook's was not just officially munitions, but this was for Minister for Aircraft Production. I'm not sure.
Right.
Or maybe you're correct that Beaverbrook held it during the Battle of Britain. It could be that case. But more broadly, I just noticed that these, like, the Labourites are creeping into the coalition.
They are.
They are. And the old school Chamberlainites are gone. And even like the Liberals, Lloyd George is gone.
But do you think it would have been able to, do you think the government would have been able to execute the war without, it
definitely needed a coalition.
Like they needed Labour into it, but I suppose
that was a lesson they did learn from the First World War. To bring in a coalition.
Are you suggesting that they could have somehow still managed to sideline Labour policy, like how Labour? I mean, I don't know. Are you suggesting that it was almost like a sort of Labour used this opportunity to sort of create the conditions for the situation.
That's why I said it would be a very interesting
found
book in
all
and of
these
itself.
Institutions, the National Health Service,
I'm postulating that as an idea, and I would like to, if someone has written a good book on that, I'd like to read it, maybe to come with a proper conclusion. But as I read this and I'm like highlighting these guys' Cripps, they're filtering in. Yeah, that comes to my mind. How much of this is concerted? Is Labour's vision more already on the peace, and Churchill's is too much on just crushing Hitler?
And so thus Britain too was a victim of a coup in a sense.
Yeah, but more broadly, a coalition needed to happen. I think that was a lesson learned from the First World War, right? Like where Asquith was completely inadequate, and then only when Lloyd George came in could they actually turn into the war machine. Right, so then Britain did need to be as much of a war machine as it could be. I
guess let's so D-Day itself then, I guess let's
if you can carry on to
that. So let's see. Well, I don't know. I don't have much to say about it other than that it was a great battle and successfully pulled off, and I suppose that is like, although the war ends in 1945, I guess that's sort of the date in most people's minds even today of like more than VE Day. I think D-Day is seen as like I guess it's like, would you agree that it's seen as a psychological end of the war almost? Like no one knows anything about the war after D-Day. I feel like the average person who's interested in history, when you speak to them, they're like, oh yeah, like
it's possible. I think that era is really interesting, 44 to 45.
I agree.
Because that's when the peace is happening, and there's still loads of everything's still on the table. Leading into D-Day itself, from the Churchillian perspective, as you said, he wanted the underbelly anyway. And they actually did get bogged down in Monte Cassino, and I think he was happy he was able to declare that Rome was liberated before D-Day. I think they happened pretty much around the same day. So Churchill's mind was still on these old civilizations. Like you could say that's quite it. Like that's the dance between English-speaking peoples. America was like sledgehammer, go in, and then Churchill is wanting to it'll be a little more crafty in policy, but also his world is that of like liberating Rome. Will have a sort of effect on him.
He didn't want to bomb.
That was the other thing I was going to say. Right. He was under pressure to bomb it as well.
Yeah, and he I think like I actually do respect these old civilizational ideals that he held. I mean, I think it would have been a great shame if they bombed everything in Rome to rubble.
Yeah, agreed. That is definitely a redemptive aspect of his policy on this. But even though, as you say, D-Day is the big day, It's kind of, it wasn't Churchill's day really. His was more that Rome piece, right? I think they were.
Do you
announced
think
around
he
the same
then
time.
sees the Germans in that same way, like the way
He
that the
sees the
Romans saw the
Germans. Yes,
the Germanic
that is definitely
barbarians?
there. I mean, he talks
Yes,
about Prussian barbarism all the time.
yeah.
And yeah, absolutely, like crossing the Rhine, it's like crossing into, and that's why he didn't have the same feeling with regards to German towns.
No,
You can, which is very, like, I find it
as
strange,
if
you
Goethe
know.
and
Yeah, Wagner,
Beethoven had
Bach,
never.
like,
Yeah,
somehow he had a switch in his brain, and it's almost, it is like Roman. It's like he just read so much bloody Horace that I don't know, Tacitus or something.
Horace Horace was responsible for the bombing of Dresden.
Yes,
I
yeah,
like
you've
that.
heard it here finally. When will he be haul out his corpse in front of the Hague? No, but I think even by then, I noted some other dates. So he's in Cairo when he hears of 200,000 troops surrendering at Stalingrad. This has happened long before D-Day, and then he has had to. So I think at that point, and you also say at the point of the Pearl Harbor, Churchill's already foreseen a lot of this, so it doesn't actually have an enormous emotional impact on him the day itself. Another thing we didn't touch upon is the Bengal famine, which I think occurs in 43, which often gets cited against him. And I'm just on around page 786. This was a little bit earlier, 42 to 43, that winter. On 16th October, a cyclone hit Bengal and Orissa, destroying rich harvest. So yeah, it was a multiplicative factors, but nominally, I mean, to label this at Churchill, I think the only thing you can say is some messages were sent and not really credited in terms of the extremity of how bad it was. But considering the wartime effort, I think it's kind of understandable that perhaps there was a little bit of oversight. But anyway, there was a cyclone hit Bengal to Orissa, destroying the rich harvest. Muslim-dominated local administration, elected under the terms of the India Act 1935, dealt with the problem corruptly and negligently, and Lord Linlithgow, the viceroy, and other British Raj officials failed to get a grip of the situation early enough. Hard pressures of a world war for the first time for many years had brought conditions of scarcity, and then basically the Japanese had maintained a large fleet in the Bengal Bay since April 42 and had bombed eastern Indian cities. So I don't know, why does this get brought up against him? I don't understand. It's clearly a factor of war.
I mean, I guess he made. There's one thing which I think the only thing that can be said against him is I think other dominions, Canada and Australia, offered to send shipments of grain, and he's like, no, we don't need that. I think that's the one thing. But yeah, other than that, he's absolutely not responsible.
I mean, he does eventually come around because 4th of August 43, he agreed 150,000 tons of Iraqi barley. I forget they still technically had Iraq at this point. And Australian wheat. Yeah, the Australian relief definitely could have come in, I think. But again, it should have been a prized jewel even above that. And that would have been, if you had given India and Singapore and the Asian theater it's the primacy it deserved, or maybe not primacy, but equity with the Western theater, then, perhaps you can all lump it into that same sort of mindset that occurred with the fall of Singapore.
Exactly.
Australia is close enough that if you coordinate that, yes. Even though I think there was other calls where, like, at other points, maybe with an invasion scare, Churchill was wondering if he could land in India, and it was basically considered with the INC too much of a political powder keg, I think.
And so, first of all, the shipment from India of grain that was already there was a blunder committed by the administration in India, not by the British government at home. Not to mention the fact that the British government was, involved in a war and primarily, I think the European theater had to have ultimate primacy, but if from the beginning they had, as you say, given the Asian theater its full, the full attention that it deserved, India was the crown jewel of the British Empire. So I think it's a shame that they like generally overall simply abandoned it, and of course that leads all the way up to the moment of partition. I think I don't know how long they would have been able to maintain governance over the area, but in my opinion, if Britain had somehow managed to maintain governance of India and of Israel, both of those places would be infinitely better governed today than they are. So, yes.
Yeah, well, I'll leave the discussion of Modi to another. I think it's quite sad. I actually really wanted to get to to see the Raj path, because it was still largely left as it was. But I think Modi wants to build loads of new buildings there, and he kind of used COVID as an excuse. I probably won't get there until he's ruined it. But
very unfortunate.
So we'll move into this kind of post DDay 44 to 45 mindset, and this idea of the peace, he's going to lose the election, a few other things. 773 though, right before now this is mentioned earlier, but it does have to do with that run-in, is the establishment of the NHS, and Churchill's mind of what that meant is we must establish on broad and solid foundations a national health service. Here let me say that there is no finer investment for any community than putting milk into babies. Healthy citizens are the greatest asset any country can have. And I mean, compare to the NHS today, where it's, you know, keeping obese people. I mean, I think most people who use it are probably obese and unhealthy, and it's kind of keeping them from whatever their body has become riddled with. It's the complete opposite of that statement. And again, that's
keeping the obese perfectly. You're right. Maintaining them in this almost like state of paralysis where they don't become less obese, but they also, don't have a heart attack right away, and then also, colluding with the.
But there's good sentiments we had there
children
in that Churchill specific vision, and maybe it's hard to know how much he agreed with it though in terms of fiscal policy, right? But the war definitely lent unity and a sort of, you can say, socialist ideal into Britain, into the services as well. And we'll get back to that in the election, where Roberts points out that 3 million people voted for the services, and Churchill acknowledged this in the lead up to that 45 election. He said the services are all going to vote against me because they wanted the welfare state after the war effort. And like that solidarity had sort of turned itself into socialism, and they were more receptive to the Labour vision because everyone's day-to-day life was already on a war footing, if you know what I mean.
Yes. And because they, if they come home and they see that their house is now a pile of bricks, they might,
and they wanted a pension, they wanted security when they came back.
Yeah.
But the NHS piece, and like that little snippet there, it's a bit like, Baden-Powell and the Scout movement. It's and his statue has been under attack in the last few years, of course. It's about getting vitality into a nation and making sure you haven't gone into complete disrepair and on a physical footing, because man is we lose this traction so often, and in the 20th century is beginning to be, it's during that century that we lost it. It was like man as this physical, like it's the same man that's still described in Homer.
Yes.
It's still there, and flourishing. We yet to see like a flourishing civilization that doesn't have that idea of like the human body in a vital effort, state of vitality.
Like something that was gradually dispensed. Churchill himself I like some of his statements when he says like, the secret to long life is never play sports, or his other one, which is
we do have to caveat that. We're like, just look at a picture of Churchill himself. His cigars and his drink, and
like I feel like that idea, like this statesman, a heavingly fat statesman who sort of sit in velvet chairs and sip on port was sort of an idea, but like by that point, and that's like what, like the middle of the 19th century, you're already starting to lose the Homeric ideal, and then the 20th century totally dispenses with it. But or what was the other one that he said? My favorite pastime is being a pallbearer for those of my friends who practice running and calisthenics. Yeah.
So I'm just gonna say, in the build-up, actually, this is one thing, and I don't know enough about Anthony Eden's career without the context. I only kind of know it through this Churchillian context. But around this time, also, there's this idea of making Eden viceroy, or even when he loses the election, he still comes back for the second premiership, and he really have handed the baton over to Eden much earlier. I don't know if you have an opinion on that, or on Anthony Eden more generally in this sort of 45 transition piece. Would him as viceroy made any difference in 45? Would him as an earlier PM made any, or an earlier leader of the Tory party in opposition in those years made any sort of difference?
Yeah, well, like Eden was supposed to be the young, the young gun who was coming up, and then Churchill clinging onto power with his every, I
think you can definitely say he clung on to like that 51 to 55 premiership should have been Eden's, really.
It was I would say that was an ignoble premiership, and it was. I mean, there's something to be said for the fact that he was elected in his 80s and became prime minister, just had that one final term. I mean, because I guess it was sort of vindication, because if you look at his electoral record before, it's like the people really liked him, but with him as head of the government, he had never actually gone. He'd only ever lost an election, right? He was pushed into the top spot, and then he led the people, and then he loses as soon as the war is over. And so if you look at it like that, I feel like maybe he personally wanted to just like make sure that people actually did in fact like and respect him. In the position of prime minister, which he succeeded in doing. Nonetheless, the premiership as a whole was ignoble. I don't think Anthony Eden was a dud anyway. Like overall, like he wasn't. Do you think that he would have had?
No, actually, yeah. Well, this is where I need to read a bit more into his character. But like, when you think of Suez, you're not thinking of a strong statesman. Would he by 57 have been, or was Suez 56 by then, been a better equipped to handle that post-world order? And maybe if they'd teamed up with the French and realized they're going to dig their heels in over this a bit more, maybe he would have had more confidence to do that if he had been established earlier with the great roles, perhaps. But I don't know enough about it. But you're right in just my two steps back reading of Eden's character is that it wasn't there, right? And this whole point of what he was
thought that he was just the idea that the Tory party's obsession with Anthony Eden as a young man was look, he had some talents, no doubt, but it was sort of mistaken. I mean, they tied their cart to the wrong horse. It was like
kind of like, and we discussed this. Was it their Bonner Law one? No, it was their Baldwin obsession in the 20s. I think we discussed this idea of that sort of Tory vacuum of power in the early 20s and how pivotal that was. I think that was on part 2 of our stream. Mm-hmm. It's kind of, there's an element of a rerun there where they back these people. They have this great vision of where the party needs to go now, sort of thing. And then they back the people. And then it's kind of the opposite of what we were mentioning with Stalin, was the vision of how to succeed the party. They blindly follow it, even if the character of the person for the premiership they're pointing to reveals themselves to be inadequate.
I mean, for me, Anthony Eden is just the man, a mustached man with heart disease who, I just think of that. I just keep imagining him like getting his surgeries. I think he collapse when he was on a diplomatic visit to the United States or something like that, and had to get a surgery.
Sure. That sounds
awful, he was, and then the Suez thing, he just seems to me like the absolute opposite of vitality. And I don't admire him at all.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm largely in agreement, but I would like to, I postulated this idea, like, if you gave him more time. But yeah, ultimately, perhaps it failed. The ideal of Eden in his younger years, again, they didn't realize that he hadn't grown into his expectations from the 30s onwards.
When it comes to Bonner Law, I have a personal respect for him because he's the only prime minister in British history to have not to be born outside of the British Islands, and he was a Canadian from New Brunswick, in the same way that Beaverbrook was. Actually, they're both men from New Brunswick who sort of went to Britain and made their way.
Yeah, definitely echoes of a Canada that could have emerged there in the 20th century, I think.
Yes, which did not, and now it's now look at it. But yeah, those are two men are in my eyes like the sort of the ideal. I mean, like the ideal Canadian that you're right could have emerged. There was a bit of that with Conrad Black, but overall, yeah, we missed it. So anyway.
Someone talked a bit more maybe about Churchill's idea of how he handed over power here. We'll just get some more snippets from the book. 848. Until the spring of 1944, the British Empire had between a quarter and a third more divisions fighting the Axis globally than the United States. By January 45, the Americans had 60% more. And Churchill, in November 44, is talking to Roosevelt, and he says, "You will have the greatest navy in the world. You will have, I hope, the greatest air force. You will have the greatest trade. You will have all the gold. But these things do not press my mind with fear, because I'm sure the American people, under your reacclaimed leadership, will not give themselves over to vainglorious ambitions, and that justice and fair play will be the lights to that guide them." The truth was that Churchill was more hopeful than certain at this stage that Roosevelt would be there to guide. I guess, of course, he's talking to a guy who was going to be dead by April. Would be there to guide the post-war America. I think that's highlighted as well, that I think, the election happens in May 45, and then immediately when Truman gets in, he's meeting with Stalin on a one-to-one basis, and Churchill's out of the loop. I think he still did know about the dropping of the bomb in Hiroshima. So Potsdam wraps up August 45. So then, just some dates that people don't know. This is how it runs. It all kind of happens from April 45 onwards. 9th of April, Labour say they don't want to stay in coalition. 12th of April, FDR dies. 30th of April, Hitler dies. 7th of May, German surrender. And then 23rd of May, Churchill has resigned as PM of the coalition. And then we said, by the end of the summer, Truman would be meeting separately with Stalin. Stalin's the only guy who survives the whole thing. In terms of that's famous, hence why he probably did so well out of the peace.
The image is very appropriate. Stalin's the only guy who survived the whole thing, and indeed, the Soviet Union was the only entity that really survived that war, because, as you know, the West from that moment on, it won the war and then fell. It was a what would you call it? A Pyrrhic victory, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any other pieces then of his. I mean, something that struck me was this. So Churchill then has to live to see the Indian independence, which Labour were always more happy to give. And then, of course, it turns into a fiasco with the partition. And I think Burma, what page is that on? 902. Burma in particular. Of course, you have to remember his father had annexed Burma into the empire.
Mm-hmm, yes. Yeah, I remember now.
Or Upper Burma, the whole piece. So it would have touched Churchill particularly. Have it here. These Burmese who were patriotically fighting the British and Indian troops to defend the soil of Burma from the Japanese conquerors. Great cruelties were perpetrated on those men because they had helped us to resist the Japanese. Oh, I think it's because of here. Yeah. The phrase, no, that's it. 5th of November, Churchill attacked Burma Independence Bill. This is the 5th of November, 47. And in particular, the actions of U Aung San, which is the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, who was recently in the news, wasn't she? Because, a few years ago, they kicked all the Muslim minorities out of the country, wasn't it?
Yes, and she was also, and then there was also a coup by the military in Burma.
During the height of the pandemic, it was very kind of dystopian images, I remember. But it said the Burmese nationalist leader, anyway, this guy. So yeah, she's the heir to all of this. who had supported the Japanese, and in Churchill's words, quote, raised what might call a quisling army to come into the tail end of the Japanese and help conquer the country. So basically, they had handed over independence to people who had sided with the Japs, and he said many of the Burmese had not done that, had actually fought with the British, and had been slaughtered by these people, and now you're giving those independence. So that in particular would have rankled with him. But you have the whole Randolph piece.
By the old Moulmein pagoda, looking lazy at the sea, there's a Burma girl a settin', and I know she thinks of me. For the wind is in the palm trees, and the temple bells they say, "Come you back, you British soldier! Come you back to Mandalay."
Oh yes, indeed. I think it's quite poignant, and actually, we can, unless you have something else to say on the piece, you want to talk about perhaps his retired life or anything, because of course he lives all the way into 65.
The
but I don't really
summer,
have any piece on that. For me, the big closing,
the Indian summer without India. Sorry.
The closing kind of poignant piece for me actually happens like 1904, page 904, where Roberts talks about. Now, I think Churchill's embellishing it slightly here because he writes an article come short story entitled "The Dream" and how his father Randolph comes back to visit him. I found those pages really, I don't know, it's almost like Shakespearean. Again, it's this dying flame of like Churchill's view as an Englishman in that set in that civilization too.
Absolutely, yeah. I completely
bring like the Hamlet. There's a Hamlet's ghost element to it, or who was it? The ghost of the table in Macbeth, where it says, "If you could seat anyone here, whom would it be?" She assumed he would say Marlborough, Caesar, Napoleon. "Oh, my father, of course," he immediately replied. He told her, this was him talking to some of his family. And then he goes into how he had this dream. "I turned around with my palette in my hand, and there, sitting in my red leather upright armchair, was my father. He looked just as I had seen him in his prime, and as I had read about him in his brief year of triumph, 85-6, which is the Burma piece. He might be the best of tempers, but he was still putting his son in his place." And yeah, I think he famously doesn't tell him that he won, that he had, no, so he tells him that he won the war. I think he maybe doesn't say he was ever prime minister. The vast Victorian
he doesn't mention his role at all, whatsoever in it.
The vast Victorian stone building at 100 Pall Mall had been destroyed by German bombs on the night of 14th of October 1940, and he says, "I thought it would have lasted longer. The structure seemed quite solid." Then they discuss the Church of England, and Churchill reveals that we have a socialist government with a very large majority, but makes no mention of whom they won it from. Instead, they talk of Arthur Balfour, who Winston reports, quote, "came an awful electoral cropper," without mentioning that he was himself in part responsible. Churchill adds of the Labour Party, "You know, Papa, though stupid, they are quite respectable and increasingly bourgeois." Winston tells his father that he makes his living as a writer, and that Blenheim was still in the hands of their family, although most of it was occupied by MI5, a government department formed in the war. "War, do you say? There's been a war. We have had nothing else but wars since democracy took charge," says Churchill. Winston explained that Britain... So I think I like the fact Roberts goes in and gives you this. He doesn't... it can be quite easy to brush off the dream, like in a Churchill biography, but I think it's quite poignant.
This is extremely important for Churchill's character. I think it's an absolutely essential addition. If you're going to, as Roberts does in a full biography, he brings up the writings from before when Churchill's talking about the dream that he had of a war with Russia. A great war was coming, and he describes himself in these sort of prophetic terms. Well, if you're going to include those writings, I think this writing, you have to include this essay that he wrote. Have you read the full essay?
Did I? I might not have read it in its entirety. I now read these passages originally a few years ago. I'm just going back through highlighted snippets. I don't think I did read the whole thing. How long is it though? It's an article come short story, so it's not.
It's not too long. It takes like 10 minutes to read.
Actually, funnily enough, if it's in the right vein, recently enough, I bought this. It's called the Golden Age of Victoria Short Stories or something. It's a publication by Penguin, and it opens with Kipling's "The Man Who Would Be King," and he's probably writing in that vein, and there is a talent there. There is something like that short story as an art form. Talk about this visitation being almost Shakespearean, but it's actually not. You're right. It's more. It's like it's this short story art form. It's not a 5-act drama. It's the short story art form, which is pure, very purist 1890s Victorian, which is, of course, the world Churchill grew up in, and he's sort of codeing that now as the 50s approached.
Yeah, it is. It is an extraordinary piece of writing. I agree with that judgment. It's like it's not. You're right that it's Shakespearean, but it's Shakespeare. It's like if you pulled an episode from Shakespeare and like just a simple episode and decided to just read that part. Like I think that's what it's like, but it still feels complete, unlike modern short stories, which are, in my opinion, very badly done.
Oh yeah, so I highly recommend that Penguin book, or just the short stories within them, because you do see. Yeah, I grew up in a time where you're given the idea that here's a short story, and you're going, well, it's just some like little practice for somebody who it probably isn't that good. But then if you read Kipling or Hardy's genuine short stories from that time, or H.G. Wells, even someone on
even
the
Arthur
progressive
Conan Doyle,
side,
frankly.
yes, and Doyle is in this collection as well.
Nice.
You begin to see the art form more than just a sort of second tier work.
I have a collection of I think all of Doyle's Sherlock Holmes short stories, and also a collection. Now this collection is not 19th century Victorian. It's Hemingway's short stories, and I actually think that Victorians were better at doing short stories than Hemingway was, as blasphemous as that might have seemed to an American. But I think like the last good short stories were done by like Hemingway kind of he pulled it off, but the only reason he was able to was because I just think of like they were always so depressing. There was always the sort of the I don't know, like the image of death was imprinted against them. So whenever you finished, even if the story itself didn't feel complete, you're sort of like, oh yes, well these people are just going to die or whatever. I just know how it's gonna. That was sorry. It's not a discussion of Hemingway. Let's get back to the point.
Yeah, I just want to close out that dream piece. Robert says the dream can also be read as lament for the demise of British power and Victorian certainty. I think it's interesting he makes that. He doesn't just say British power. That sense of certainty that the Victorians had, which certainly afflicted Churchill badly in the year that the jewel in the crown of the British Empire was lost, something that Churchill always saw as a tragedy. And even later, page 945, when getting later into the Indian summer, there's trouble in Kenya and all of this, Churchill could see the way the post-war mood was turning against colonialism. I could have defended the British Empire against anyone, he told an aide later on, except the British people. Yeah. He had kept his promise of 1942 not to preside over the liquidation of empire, with no part of it becoming independent during his time as Prime Minister. But the year after he left office, Sudan gained its independence, then Ghana, Malaya, modern-day Malaysia in 57, and then finally Kenya in 64. So, yeah, there's that interesting piece that he still wouldn't let, even in the 51-55 premiership, nothing actually did leave. No territory was lost, which is interesting. So that's everything I think I have to say on the matter. I'm not sure if you have anything else on his final years.
I have a few more things, just very brief though. So, I think Churchill spent his much of his final years sort of. He had many wealthy friends. And he spent, I just, think of Churchill, he would spend a lot of time yachting with, the Onassis family, Aristotle Onassis. It's interesting because when he would travel and go on vacation, of course, he wouldn't go with his wife. And his wife, when she would travel, wouldn't go with him. But nonetheless, I mean, they didn't seem to. I think his wife maybe had one affair, but other than that, they didn't seem to have gone for those purposes. They just wanted time, like, and they loved each other very much. It was like it was a faithful, loving relationship, but they still needed that sort of vacation on their own. It's interesting. So I think all of these trips that he took afterwards were not with Clementine. But he had a very sort of, I really like that. I like declining into the sunset on a yacht. It's the best way to go. I guess.
And his burial still did have that sense. I think there was a piece in the war where you can almost feel him being upset he didn't die. He kind of wanted a Nelson moment. Of course, he wasn't fighting the same way Nelson was, but he still gets that Nelsonian send-off.
He does. Oh, yes. His funeral is actually very important. I would like to say a few words on the funeral. I think his funeral was probably the greatest funeral in the history of the world. It was it was attended on the ground by, I think, 350,000 people. It watched around the world by like something like 50 million, and maybe probably more than that. It was, what were the descriptions again? I need to go back to it. Hang on, I have the numbers here. Here, a second. Okay, yeah, I think something like 1% of the world watched his funeral. Anyway, I think. Wait, let's see. Ah, yes, here. So, it was attended by representatives from 120 countries. It was the first. It was the Queen herself went to the funeral, of course, and the only two that she's gone to are Churchill of a prime minister, are Churchill and Thatcher. Escorted by 1,000 police and security personnel, 9 military bands, 18 battalions, 16 RAF fighter jets, a special boat, and a special train. And Churchill's body lay in state in Westminster Hall for 3 days by decree of Queen Elizabeth. The service was held at St. Paul's thereafter, and finally the body was transported to Blaydon, where it was buried. And it was the largest state funeral in history. The pictures from the funeral are absolutely extraordinary. You should look them. For anyone who hasn't seen this, you should look them up. It's, when I think of grand funerals, this is the primary one. This is the best embodiment of that idea.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to be able to see those images, because for me, that it makes when you read about Nelson's and other ones in time that you couldn't have seen, it gives a greater sense of what the state funeral like that would have been. You know what I mean?
Oh yes, certainly.
It makes the Nelson one feel more real certainly to myself.
There was the Nelson funeral, and then there was also the Wellington. Yeah. Wellington's funeral was a great funeral as well. I think that was the other great state funeral in British history. There was a quote from the British historian Dr. Rouse. He says, "The western sky filled with the lurid glow of winter sunset, the sun setting on the British Empire." And I guess this was not only a send-off to Churchill, but a send-off of Imperial Britain. I mean, the whole regalia of Imperial Britain was there, and that really is it was their final display of any sort of imperial might. You still have the marches and things today, but it's not really the same thing. I think Churchill's funeral is actually an extremely important moment in 20th century history, which is actually not, it's sort of glossed over by most people who talk about the 20th century. Even if they talk about Churchill, they forget to mention his funeral. And I think his funeral is absolutely pivotal to recount if you're talking about his life and if you're talking about the decline of Imperial Britain. It was it's one of my favorite events of the 20th century, in fact.
Yeah, there's something about it happening and like amidst Beatlemania as well. It's just
exactly
this absurd just element to it that was Churchill's life. That's probably a part of the reason why we spent 4 parts delving through it. There's so much out there. To start off with like Kitchener and the Sudan, and then to end with like Beatlemania, it's insane. But there was this sort of linchpin through it all.
Mm-hmm.
Again, with that dream piece, I think properly encapsulates the tragic element of it. Yeah. So
It does. It was very tragic. It was beautiful. It was tragic. Yeah, just an absolutely sublime event. An event with. I'm not any great. Well, I'm not a. Frankly, I'm an atheist. However, it was an event with spiritual significance, in my opinion, and it was. Yeah, that's all.
okay.
That's all. Now,
Thanks.
what's
Yeah,
your
go ahead.
overall? Finally, I remember at the beginning of the stream you said that of all these streams, sorry, the first video, you said that your overall impression of Churchill is that you didn't really like him that much. Did you say that? I mean, why was that?
Yeah, I think it's that idea of seeing over the Singapore piece, allowing that 45 Labour post to set the post-war tempo. I think if you go back further back as well, his early writings of World War One will always jar with me. But of course, I have hindsight, right? I
Oh, you
know
mean this
the great,
glorious, beautiful
yeah,
war or
that
whatever? No,
glorious,
but
glorious war
he was
passages.
being sort of facetious. I mean,
He
it
did
wasn't.
love war, though,
He
and there's
did.
a part of him which wanted it. And I suppose this is add to the tragedy, though, because before the Great War, um, you could kind of have that. I wouldn't necessarily. Yeah, it was always horrible, but there was glory to it. And then it seemed
Yeah.
after that war, because of the mechanized sense of it, we talked about the Homeric ideal and getting rid of it,
Mhm.
or it's waning, the waning of it throughout the 20th century. The mechanized horror of the Great War sapped that out, and it did sap virility out of and a sense of nobility out of warfare. But for Churchill, it didn't seem to happen that way. He still seemed to look. I mean, he was probably old enough, right?
I
His
don't know.
tendencies
No,
were locked in.
I think he saw the during the war he may have said that, but at the end of it, I think he really did see that this war of mechanized brutality was basically the war that rang the death knell of European civilization. I'm not sure that I disagree that he never saw this. I'm absolutely certain that he had the sense of the war as that, even if in the moment of the war happening, because he was not aware of the full proportions of what would take place, he felt exhilarated. I think it's I think it's unfair to say that he wanted these mechanized wars, these horrors to continue. I mean, I think at the end of his first book, no, not his first book, but his book about his early life, my early life. I have it somewhere here. Oh, I can't find it. But anyway, he says that we in that innocent time didn't realize, we loved war and we didn't realize what that would come to mean in the future, um, and there's
Yeah, but I
obviously
suppose
regret.
there's a strain of innocence to him that carries on right up until that dream sequence. I mean, even when I read out the passages there of his sort of baton handing over to Roosevelt, and his idea of the British-speaking peoples,
English, yeah.
English, sorry, is there is still that naivety. There's a
There,
new naivety, you could say, than
yeah.
the one you're talking about. But
No, but that's not a martial naivety. That's like a civilizational naivete. He
mm,
just thought that, you know, that Western this was the time of the rise of a new West rather than the decline of
one
everything good and
thing,
beautiful.
one thing though that did emerge that slightly dampened my criticism. I still think the tactic should have been to stay out for as long as possible, but it's not just Churchill, right? There was nobody there. I think you could have had some sort of peace that, of course, was not a peace with Hitler, right? But you force him against Stalin earlier. But when you actually go through Roberts as he's detailing the events week by week, when you get into that level of it, it gets more difficult to say right here and there, that's where you do it. And if you can't point that out, then usually you don't really have good counterfactual history.
Yeah,
Um,
no, yeah.
so I remember when we were going through those chapters in the late 30s, there is no obvious point. And he's correct on, at least he stands his ground on the India bill. Um, but yeah, I think the grander strategy should have been, again, that's probably his naivety or his, as I said, we talked about his relationship with Stalin even though if you go back, right, he was, if you go back to our stream in the 20s, yes, he was very anti the Soviets back then. But yeah, so that was one thing I maybe went in harshly on him, as I thought he could have kept Britain out on a strategic basis because of how weak she was still after the war, like the same way. And you can say, oh, that's horrible because it was Hitler, blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, look at the States. That's how they played both world wars. They came in late and dictated the peace.
Yes, but yeah, no, it's true. Yeah.
So I thought there was a bit more of that could have been done. But then when you're actually through them, it's not on Churchill. When you go through those,
when
you go through those days and weeks, there is no, maybe someone else wants to point them out, comment below, go ahead. I'm all ears. But I remember when I was just reading through it, nothing stood out as a very obvious counterfactual. Even Halifax, again, you're kind of thinking the Eden syndrome. And was he really a character capable of then entering later at
the holy fox?
Because you would have got dragged in eventually. The question was trying to get dragged in.
Roberts actually defends Halifax in one of his earlier.
Oh yes,
books, right?
Yeah. Roberts is quite conciliatory towards Halifax. I haven't read that book, but yeah, I've seen interviews and his background.
Roberts, he doesn't like Chamberlain, but he's a fan of Halifax. Now, I was going to say, no matter what your judgment of Churchill is, I suppose from the objective, historical, maybe even Carlylean perspective, he is a great man of history.
Oh yes, and that's of course why I wanted to do this stream. You come out of the biography with that sense, and I suppose Roberts has done a good job in conveying that.
I would say Roberts has done an extraordinary job in conveying. There is no fuller. I think even if you read the really long, like the other one, Martin Gilbert's ongoing, history of Churchill, like or not ongoing, but his massive 10-volume biography of Churchill, even that's like, I feel like this is the best distillation of Churchill's greatness in a way that doesn't become overwhelming.
That's
but in
a
a way
good word.
Which
I actually met Roberts
everything.
at the festival, and I was trying to say that to him. I didn't use that word, distillation. That was a good word.
Well, next time you meet him, it's you can convey that if you meet him again, which I'm sure is a great possibility.
If I need to keep my eyes on these book festivals. Anyway, thanks everybody. And yeah, I mean, I enjoyed this discussion, Dominus. I realized it took us a while to finally get the time in the diary for this one, but it's good to put the bookend on it, I suppose. And if you're ever open for any streams in the future, I'm sure we can discuss that in time.
We will.
Thanks everybody.
It's been a great series, and thank you to everyone who listened.
Thanks a lot, guys. Catch you next time.